two members that are here. Tyler Edgar, as Father mentioned, is the executive director of Creation Justice Ministries, which is affiliated with the National Council of Churches, a group that I've been involved with. Our other panel member is Maria Hetzolas, if I say it right, her coastal marine specialist from the World Bank Group. I will not take too much more time and let them just start talking. Would you please go first, Maria?
Good morning, reverends and clergy and esteemed guests. It's really a pleasure to be here this morning. I think I need to just start my PowerPoint, however. Yeah. Okay. And I'm going to try to go quickly through these slides. I think images always speak very powerfully. So I hope you'll bear with me, and we can have a little bit of a chance for some discussion afterwards. Okay. Yeah. Yes, Sacred Connections. The title of my talk is Sacred Flows and Vital Connections, Water and the Sea Around Us. And thank you. What I'd like to do this morning is to help you understand, help all of us understand the vital connections between fresh water and the ocean, which surrounds us, and why it is so important to maintain these connections, the sacred flows of the water cycle, the hydrological cycle, and what happens when we disrupt these very important connections in terms of our own health and that of life on the planet. So what I will do is try to touch on three basic themes. The first one is the sanctity of water and its centrality to life on the planet. The second is this notion of sacred flows in the form of what we call the hydrological cycle. I think many people don't really understand where water comes from. The ocean is the source of all fresh water on the planet. And it really helps to understand and to be mindful of these sacred flows and connections. We also have to understand that water, of course, is the essence of life, but it also is the basis for other forms of life on Earth, and it carries with it the absolute essentials for life. So understanding these flows and the connections is extremely important. And then the third theme is what happens when we disrupt these connections, what it means for us, for life on Earth, and what we can do about it as responsible human beings, as good Christians, as mindful, responsible people. So the notion that water is sacred has been around for a long time. Certainly has been part of the discussion of His All Holiness, the Patriarch, for many, many years. And in fact, he has spoken of it on many occasions. Let me quote from the very beginning in this theme of the sanctity of water from one of his statements on the eve of World Oceans Day. He said, "We are united by water, which comprises 70% of our body and 70% of the Earth's surface. All life depends on its nourishing power. Flowing water makes our planet unique among all the planets, as we know, in the universe. And in fact, it's the search for water that is what we do first when we're looking for life on any potential planet that could sustain life. Is there water, or has there been water? Water is a source of wonder and beauty, a cause of celebration and connection." And that was on the eve of World Oceans Day in 2003. Now, we also have seen in ancient times the importance of water. And I would like to quote from the oath which the Athenians gave before their battle. And this was inscribed on on a stone plaque after the Battle of Plataeus in 479 BC against Perseus. And one of the things that the Athenian soldiers said and vowed to do upon their victory was, "I shall not deprive nor friends nor enemies from running waters." This is in respect for the fundamental essence of water as being essential for life. And I think it's extremely relevant today, even as we see conflict around natural resources and water. But even among friends, look at the Mekong Basin. Look at the amount of damming and regulation of major waters by countries upstream, in complete sort of contradiction of international agreements where water should be free-flowing. And if you do decide to regulate, you need to have the agreement of the downstream riparians. This is being violated all the time. So the importance and sanctity of water was something we knew about for many, many, many centuries, and yet today we are violating these principles. Some of you may recognize this mosaic from the exhibit on Byzantine art, and this is basically a depiction of an earthly sort of paradise, if you will. It's a free-flowing fountain that symbolizes immortality. But again, this is from the 5th century AD. This notion of water as being sacred has been around for a very long time. Now, here is a picture that I think evokes the power and majesty and sanctity and purity of water. Let's start at the top of the water cycle, the hydrological cycle. And you can see the clouds very sort of at the top of the watershed in the mountains. Those are the form of condensation of water, ultimately from the ocean, which then is captured by these rainforests and converted into rainwater and precipitation and eventually begins to flow. Now, this is a very schematic depiction of the water cycle, but essentially, I think there's a pointer here. Oops, I didn't want to do that. If you look in the far left-hand corner, you'll see the clouds that are condensing over the mountaintops. Now, before the water starts flowing downstream, and depending on the climate and the elevation, a lot of this comes down as snow and is stored on the surface of the earth as ice. This is the glaciers and the polar ice caps. It's an extremely important form of surface water in the solid state, and very, very important source of fresh water. Water also is infiltrated deep into the earth, and that then flows into groundwater stores or aquifers. And in fact, the underwater storage of water is many, many, many times what we see on the surface. So deep below the Sahara Desert, for instance, there are huge, vast stores of water in the form of groundwater. Unfortunately, they are inaccessible at the moment with current technology. Much of the water is actually taken up by plants. And we know that forests store water. They eventually transpire that water back into the atmosphere. And then some of the water takes the form of surface water and can be stored temporarily in lakes. But ultimately, it all flows into the ocean, where again, it evaporates and forms into cloud through condensation to start the process anew. Oops. Now, this is a slide that I took over Samoa, and it's very difficult for you to see because of the light, but basically it shows you a bit of the watershed in the form of these mountains at the top and water flowing through rivers into the sea. And you can see at this bottom part of the picture that the water is quite cloudy. That's because of deforestation upstream in the watershed, which is bringing huge amounts of sediment loads into the water, onto coral reefs, and basically creating all sorts of impacts downstream. If the forests are intact, if the plant cover and land cover is intact, we can look forward to something like this underwater. And again, the sort of notion of light, energy from the sun and water creating life is part of this cycle. So once again, the cycle starts anew, and these are the sacred flows that have to be maintained. But we all know that this is not the real world. In fact, as the water does come downstream, it collects nutrients from agriculture, from municipal waste, from leaching in the soil of pesticides. All sorts of pollutants can be carried into the water, as well as life forms. Water carries all sorts of things. It carries life. It also carries death in many ways. And our concept of the ocean as being able to absorb all of this waste and being infinite in its abundance is of course, not the case at all. This was a misconception, one that we could entertain when there were very few of us on Earth. But as we now know, with so many people living in and around coastal areas, and given the amount of upstream activity, and now with climate change, the ocean is becoming the repository of all sorts of impacts. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about this notion of water as being precious, and the fact that we, particularly in countries of abundance, like in the United States and North America and Europe, tend to take it for granted. The blue here is a distribution of countries that are very rich in water. There's little or no water scarcity. The orange depicts countries where there is physical water scarcity. That means these are arid desert countries that basically have no water in their territory, or very little. The red is depicting economic water scarcity. These are countries that actually have water, but because of mismanagement of the water resources, it is not distributed where it's needed. And so you actually have water scarcity in areas which could be reversed. It's really a function of poor governance and poor water management. And then the other areas have not been estimated. This is an important map to be aware of. I'm sorry? Okay. Water scarcity is going to be something that we all need to pay attention to. It's going to only increase. It will be what wars are fought over, not oil, not gold, not mineral wealth. It will be water. And I want to call your attention in particular to this country, Yemen here, that is one of the most water scarce in the world. This is a picture of women who have to walk miles and miles for water in Yemen because their groundwater has been depleted. They have very little surface water. And even though the aquifers, which have been the source of water for centuries, are now being depleted to such an extent that it takes almost a day to go and fetch water. What water there does exist in the wells is used to irrigate something called khat, which is a very mild, it's a mild drug that the men take, basically to get through their day. But essentially, it has taken over the life of these people. And we're talking about a population that lives on 45% of whom live on less than $2 a day. So here we have a situation of extreme water scarcity in a country that really has very, very limited physical resources, and those water resources that they have been mismanaged. Now, getting back to the theme that we discussed earlier today about the need for discipline and controlling our passions, let's go back again to this water chart. And you remember that North America and Europe and certainly East Asia are countries that have quite a bit of water. This chart basically shows the average national water footprint per capita per year. A green color means that countries are using about the national average or less. If it's intense green, it means they use a lot less than the national average per capita per year. If it's red, it means they are using many times the national average. Guess what? In the United States, and which is a very water-abundant country, we use 3 and 4 times the national average per capita. I'm sorry, the global average per capita. So, we will use between 2,100 and 2,500 cubic meters per capita per year. That's the equivalent of a lot of cups of coffee, a lot of beef, a lot of rice. Look here what it takes to make a cup of coffee. It takes 140 liters to generate 1 cup of coffee. Why? It's not just the coffee in your cup. It's growing the bean, it's roasting it, it's importing it. The water footprint is very large, but even larger for beef. So 1 kilo of beef takes 16,000 liters to make. That's why we should really think about becoming vegetarians. At the very least, we should be aware of our water footprint. It's extremely important, particularly when there are countries who are so water stressed, who don't have access to even a fifth of what we enjoy. And because, as I said before, this will be the source of great conflict in the future. Now, in addition to using water recklessly, we also dump a lot of things into it. Now, in this case, this is a picture of Madagascar, which was a country that had rich biodiversity, biological diversity, huge forests, teeming with life, lemurs and all sorts of other animals that were unique to this island. Now, for about a 15-year period in the late 80s, there was tremendous deforestation and mining going on for economic growth, and that led to the elimination of ground cover. And because Madagascar is a very steep, high island in the sense that it has a lot of steep slopes, and when these forests were denuded and the ground cover was lost and the heavy rains, because it's in the tropics, came down, it generated a lot of sedimentation and erosion. And you can see all of this going into the sea. These plumes of sediment are literally choking the water, the submarine life. And so you not only bring sediment, you deplete the oxygen, you bring in nutrients from the ground, you create dead zones. And that is obviously going to disrupt the hydrological cycle. Now, I've talked a little bit about fresh water. What happens in the ocean? Well, as I said before, the ocean is extremely important because it is the source of all fresh water. It's also the source of more than half of the oxygen that we breathe. Why? Because we have plankton in the ocean that's generating tremendous amounts. It's photosynthesizing, generating tremendous amounts of oxygen. The ocean is also a huge sink for CO2. That is because these plants take up CO2 from the atmosphere to photosynthesize. So they're taking up the carbon dioxide, generating oxygen for us to breathe. And in fact, things like mangroves and seagrasses that are plant life that live at the margins of where the coast or the margins of freshwater and saltwater are actually tremendous natural sinks of carbon dioxide because they have a very deep organic soil. It's sort of like peat soils, which are constantly being created as sediment comes down from the land, sea levels rise a bit. This deep sediment layer has huge amounts of carbon dioxide. When we clear wetlands, we release all this CO2 into the atmosphere, and it creates a huge source of carbon dioxide emissions. So the ocean is a natural sink. It holds fantastic untapped wealth. And again, it doesn't mean that we need to consume these in the source of extraction that is not sustainable, but it can be a source of green growth. We call it the blue economy, and we can talk about that a little bit later. Also, as I mentioned before, in terms of condensation and rain, the ocean is really responsible for this entire water cycle on Earth. I want to get a little bit to the ocean's role in regulating climate because that's going to be the topic of one of the... Okay. This is next to the end of the talk. This is just to foreshadow Dr. Hansen's talk. And that is, as I mentioned before, the ocean is the Earth's main buffer to climate change. It removes half of the carbon dioxide emitted by human activities, the anthropogenic carbon dioxide, and provides most of the oxygen we breathe. It's a source of water, and it regulates temperature by circulating the heat from the sun around the globe. So it's extremely important. Ocean health equals planetary health equals human health. And I want to mention one other thing about ocean health, and that is that in addition to being something important for mitigating CO2, it's also going to be the recipient of a lot of the impacts of climate change. We know about sea level rise and thermal expansion of oceans, but some of us aren't aware of what's called ocean acidification, and that is referred to often as the evil twin of climate change. That is a change in the ocean's chemistry as a result of more CO2 in the atmosphere being absorbed into the ocean. The changes in chemistry of the water make it very difficult for shell-bearing organisms to calcify. So everything at the bottom of the food chain for fish and food webs is going to be compromised. It also means that things like coral reefs, which are the epicenter of biological diversity in the ocean, are at risk because they cannot calcify as well. They become very brittle with storms. The more intense and frequent storms, they become subject to physical destruction, and the calcification process is again compromised. So biodiversity, food webs, coastal protection, all of these are at risk as a result of climate change and ocean acidification. And I'm going to end with just this quote from His All Holiness, the Patriarch, who says that we share the miracle of water with the entire community of life. Indeed, each of us is a microcosm of the ocean that sustains life. Every person here, every person of the world is in essence a miniature ocean. And so what we do to the ocean, God's vast blue creation, we also do to God's other creations, including ourselves. So I'll leave you with that message. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. With our third panel did come here, and I apologize, I did tell the first two that you have a little bit extra time. We're going to bring up water again. I know Tyler's going to speak about water. I think both are going to point out the fact that it's going to harm people, water. So I think I will introduce our third panelist, Mr. Paporis from the International Orthodox Christian Charities, which will talk about poverty in the world. And then I think Tyler will also then talk about the effect, a major effect it would have on people with an issue that affects water. It's interesting. I just have to say with water, I always say that, you know, one of the first things that Christ did was basically enter into water, and through water he could actually touch all creation.
That's a pretty tough act to follow up, Maria. Your Eminence, Reverend Fathers, esteemed guests, as I was introduced, I represent International Orthodox Christian Charities. It's a humanitarian organization that is based in the Orthodox faith and is operating in 20 countries throughout the world presently. Over the last 20 years, we have implemented programs that span emergency response as a result of natural and man-made causes, including war, and of course long-term development. Very timely in the news, and as many of you will already know, one of our most robust interventions presently is in the country of Syria and in the surrounding countries as a result of that conflict. When one sees in the news the causes and the mitigating factors of that Syrian civil war, much will be said about sectarian differences, about minority rule oppressively over a majority population. Much will be said about foreign influence, nefarious backdealing, and perhaps a lot of this is true. But one thing that is very rarely mentioned is one of the most important causal factors in the Syrian civil war, and that's water. Two very significant factors exacerbated an already precarious situation, demographically speaking. Number one, Turkey had created a policy of establishing reservoirs along the Mesopotamian river valleys, Euphrates and Tigris. This dislocated the equivalent of flowing water of the cubic liters of the Dead Sea, causing a strain on the resources farmers used in the Euphrates Valley. From 2006 to 2011, in addition to this already lack of flowing water, there was a massive drought that resulted in the desertification of about 60% of the country of Syria. Demographically speaking, the Euphrates River Valley is populated by rural agricultural communities who are part of that majority population who is not in control of their own destiny, politically speaking. The lack of water, the lack of the ability to water their crops led to the massive displacement of approximately 1.5 million Syrians internally. People who had given up their ancestral heritage, the work, the labor of their ancestors, simply because there was no water. By 2009, 80% of the cattle had died. These people who were displaced, of course, went looking for labor in urban centers, made up demographically of a very different, or several different groups of people, which caused stresses on an already precarious system, a mosaic, a demographic mosaic of a society. The resulting chaos and the inability of the government to handle this influx of rural migrants into urban areas